Today's daf, Bez Hashem, is Masechta Zevachim Daf Nun Beis, number 52. And we'll begin from the second line from the top. And the Gemara is just in the middle of explaining a brisa. The pasuk says by a seir of a nasi that did an avera and a carbon chatas, the Torah tells us that the extra shirayim, the extra blood, you should spill at the Yesoid Mizbach Ha'olah. So that's extra. We know that from a Kal V'chomer. So the Gemara, the Brisa Darshan, that it comes to teach you that you're supposed to pour all the blood of any carbon oila, the extra blood, down the Yesoid. Down the Yesoid Mizbach Oila, as you can see in this picture over here, after he sprinkles the blood of a carbon oila, he pours the extra blood down the drain. So that is derived from that pasuk. So the Brisa said, "Oy einoi, oy einoi." Maybe it's just telling you, "Ella mizbach shel oila yehei yisoid." Maybe the pasuk is only teaching you that a carbon oila, the actual sprinkling, should be done on the part of the mizbeach that has a foundation over it. You see, if you look at the picture of the mizbeach, there are parts of it, as you can see from an aerial view over here, that do not have the yisoid. The yisoid is only on this side and the west side a little bit, and then a little bit on the south sides and the north south, but totally on the east, it's not there. So the pasuk is telling you when you do the initial sprinkling of the carbon oila, do it on the sides that have yisoid. So maybe it's just telling you about the initial sprinkling of a carbon oila, that it should be done over a place where it has a foundation. So the Gemara asks a question on that havamina. How could the Gemara, how could that Brisa have said such a havamina that it's only talking about a carbon oila? Mi ksiv el yisoid ha'oila. Does the pasuk say yisoid ha'oila? That means it's only talking about a carbon ha'oila. El yisoid mizbach ha'oila. It's talking about any carbon that goes on that mizbeach. So it's not just talking about a carbon oila, but any carbon, a carbon shlamim, or any other carbon that you have extra blood, should be poured down there. So what kind of havamina, is the Brisa having? Saying another interpretation of El Yisoid Misbach Ha'oila, to the foundation of the Mizbeach Ha'oila. So the Gemara re-explains the Brisa. If the pasuk would have said, poured on the Yisoid Ha'oila, Havamina, I would have thought bizakifa el Yisoid. I would have thought that when you do the sprinklings of the Mizbeach, instead of pouring it on the corner over here, on the corner, you should, or on the corner, right over here. Let me just make it red. Instead of pouring it on the corner, like you do it over here, I would pour it on the side. That maybe the Torah is telling you every carbon oil, pour it on the side. You see over here. And that's what the pasuk is teaching you. How do I know? Now that the Torah tells you Yisoid Mizbach Ha'oila, Agagay Yisoid. That's what the Brisa is saying. Now that the Torah tells you Yisoid Mizbach Ha'oila, it's talking about that it should be somewhere on top of the Yisoid, not directly on top, which possibly could be, but better off doing it in the corner over on top of the roof of the foundation, where you'll be able to accomplish Shtaim Shein Harba. So again, that was the Havamina of the Brisa. Comes along the Gemara, and the Brisa continued and said that I could never have such a Havamina, because of course, from a Kal V'chomer, I already know that you're supposed to sprinkle the blood, the initial blood of a carbon, on top of the Yisoid, on the roof, above the roof of the Yisoid. Again, the roof of the Yisoid is the top over here, right over here. Right, this is the roof of the Yisoid. You have to sprinkle it above that roof. And I know that from a Kal V'chomer. I don't need this pasuk to teach me that. And the Gemara said that both Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva came up with a Kal V'chomer that will teach me this idea. Omer Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael said, Gag hayesoid lama likra. To teach me that an initial sprinkling has to be above the roof of this foundation, what do I need a pasuk for that? Kal v'chomehi. I could figure it out myself. Uma shiore chatos she'ena mechaperes. The leftover blood after you sprinkle. Let's say after you sprinkle the blood of a kar kohen mashiach, you sprinkled it on the inside mizbeach, and now you bring it outside the sanctuary and you pour it down the drain. To unagag, you have to pour it above the roof of the yisoid, that's the way you pour the leftovers right over here. After, assuming this was not a regular katas, you just pour it down the drain on top of yisoid. So, tchilas oila shemechaperes, the initial of carbon oila, the initial sprinkling of a carbon oila that brings about kapara, ein of course, the shitu unagag yisoid, yet you have to put it on top of the roof of the yisoid. Amar Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva says the same idea. Umash yarei chatas, the leftover remaining of a chatas she'ein mechaper, that the kapara is over, it doesn't do anything. Ve'ein bo'in lechaper. Rabbi Kiva says they're not even never coming to be mechaper. To unagag yasoid teaches you the God that you needed to put it over the roof of the yasoid. Tchilas oiler shemechaperes uvo lechaper. Most carbon oilers are doing some sort of kapara, maybe for a mitzvah to say. And so the initial sprinkling, it has to be above the roof of the Yesod. So since I could figure that idea from a Talmud, from a Kal V'chomer, continues the Brisa, why does the Torah tell us that you put it by the foundation of the Mizbach ha'oila? Tein Yisoid limizbeach shel oila, that comes to teach you that idea that every korban, if you have leftover blood, you should place the blood, not throw it out, but put it by the drain, by the gag of the yisoid, that just teaches you extra, that anytime you have extra blood, just pour it down the drain there from any carbon, even though the Torah it says it only by the carbon chatas, you apply it by any other type of carbon. So again, the exercise here was that in order to prove that the pasuk was extra, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva came up with a kal v'chomer, and they said that this pasuk must be extra. It cannot be teaching you that the initial sprinkling of a carbon oila has to be above the yisoid, because just the shiorei achatas, the leftover of the carbon chatas you poured over the yisoid, never comes to be mechaper. And that yet the Torah says pour it above the yisoid, on the top of the yisoid. So also, I would never imagine that a regular carbon oila, the initial sprinkling should be right over here on the bottom, below the roof of the yisoid. So I'll never have such a havamina. So basically, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva seem to have said the same type of kal v'chomer, that shiorei hadam, the leftover blood of the carbon chatas, is not coming to be mechaper. And yet, it needs to, if you're pouring it, you pour it over the side. So also the initial blood of a carbon oila should be poured above the side. So the Gemara asks, "My benaya, what is the difference between Rabbi Kiva's kal v'chomer and Rabbi Shmuel's kal v'chomer?" Amar Rav Ada Barahava, Rabbi Barahava said, "Shiar ma'akvim ika benayu." The question is, would if, let's say, by the carbon chatas, if you didn't put the extra blood down that drain, does it invalidate the carbon? Mar Sava, Rabbi Shmuel says, yes, ma'akvi, it would invalidate the carbon chatas. Mar Sava, but Rabbi Kiva holds, loy ma'akvi, it will not invalidate the carbon. And that's where Rabbi Kiva adds on, shiorei achatas, not only the leftover doesn't bring up a kaparo when you pour it down the drain, the in boy lechaper, it doesn't need anything, it doesn't help in the kapara. That means if you didn't do it, the carbon is kosher. Rabbi Shmuel holds the carbon will not be kosher if you didn't do that part of the service. Rapapa Amar Rapapa says, the Kuli Alma, everybody would agree, Shirayim ein ma'akvi. Everybody would agree that the Shirayim, the left, would not be ma'akiv. Even Rabbi Shmuel will say that if you didn't do it, the carbon chatas is still kosher. Over here we're talking about b'mitzi chatas oif ma'akivs komipalgi. Marasova ma'akev. Rabbi Shmuel holds it's ma'akev. Marasova loy ma'akev. What are we talking about? This is what the machloek is between um, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. When you bring a bird as a korban chatas, here you see the person brought a bird, they did malika. Step two would be is he just sprinkles the blood on the mizbeach, right? But then the Torah tells you have to take the blood, sort of like take the blood of the bird and just push it against the wall, squeeze it against the wall of the mizbeach. That's like a third step. That's like the shirayim going into the hole over there. So now, you see that squeeze over there. So the question is, if you don't do that extra last step, is the korban bird chatas possible? Rabbi Shmuel says yes, and Rabbi Kiva will say no. That's the machlokes. But on a regular korban chatas, even Rabbi Shmuel will hold if you didn't spill out the extra blood into that hole, and a regular animal korban chatas, Rabbi Shmuel will hold it will not be ma'akiv. Tanya, that's the Rav Papa's understanding. So the Gemara is going to say, I'm going to prove to you that that is the version of Rabbi Yishmael. The Gemara is going to bring a long brisa over here just to prove one point. One point, the Rabbi Yishmael holds that shirayim is not ma'akif. That if you shech the par koyim Mashiach, and they did all the sprinklings inside the sanctuary, and they did not do the leftover pouring down the side of the outside mizbeach, it will still be kosher. And that's that's part of what Rav Papa said, that Rabbi Shmuel would agree that shirayim ein ma'akvin. Everybody agrees to that point. How do you see that? Tanya Kavos to Rav Papa, as kol hadam apar yishbach. The Torah tells you, let's see if I have that pasuk. As kol hadam by the par koyim mishbeach. Veskol hadam hapar, the leftover blood, yishbach, he should pour el yisoid mizbach ha'olah, asher pesach oil moyed. So now the pasuk says, ma talmud loyma hapar. What does the Torah tell you that it's talking about a cow? I know we're talking about a cow. The whole parsha is talking about a par koyim Mashiach. Lima, it teaches you a par yom kippurim sheta'on matan domin liyasoid. Divrei Rabbi, that teaches you that the par of Yom Kippur, the cow on Yom Kippur, not the par Mashiach, but also the par Yom Kippurim, you have to put the leftover blood on the outside mizbeach. Amar Rabbi Shmuel says, what do I need a pasuk for that? Kal v'choyma. Uma im es mi she'ein nichnas damay lifnim choyva ta'in yisoid. The par koyin Mashiach. There's no inyan to bring a par koyin Mashiach. It's not an obligation, and it needs a yisoid. So, and you need to pour the extra blood outside because we don't want the koyin Mashiach to sin. So, but nevertheless, if he does, this is the process. So, but there was no obligation to bring such a korban. But the par Yom Kippurim is an obligation to bring this par on Yom Kippur. So, Ein Adin certainly Shaitan Yisoid. It will need the Yisoid. It will need the Yisoid. You need to pour the extra blood by the outside mizbeach. And Rabbi Kiva even says like this: Amar Rabbi Kiva, Umami she'ein damei nichnas lefnei v'lefnim bein l'chayv bein l'sitzvah tan Yisoid. Even the par koyin Mashiach, there's no mitzvah to bring a par koyin Mashiach, and there's no mitzvah to bring that blood in the kodesh kedoshim. So, and it needs the yisoid. So this certainly, which brings its blood, a par on Yom Kippur, where you bring the blood inside the kodesh kedoshim, certainly should need yisoid. So now, if I could learn that idea that the par Yom HaKippurim needs the extra blood to be poured on the outside of Mizbeach after you finish the service, I learned it from a Kal V'choyma, from a Par Kohen Mashiach, then why indeed does the Torah write an extra pasuk by a Par Kohen Gadol that you have to pour the blood on the outside Mizbeach? So maybe the Torah is writing an extra pasuk, Yochya Akvenu. I would think that if you don't do it, the korban is pasul. Talmud Lamed is another pasuk that says "V'chila mekaper as a kodesh, shol mekal paras kulan divrei Rabbi Yishmael." There's a pasuk in Parshas Achrei Mos that says once you finish the sprinkling on the inside sanctuary, even if you didn't do anything else, the kapara is successful. So here you see, Yochel Yakvenu, and Rabbi Shmuel clearly says that the Shiorei Adam, not being spilled on the Yisod HaMizbeach, is not a holdup in the kashrus of the animal, is kashrus of the carbon. Now the Gemara says, let's do it this way. Kal v'choyma lepar koy Mashiach. Let's make a kal v'choyma to a par koy Mashiach. Miyat, ma mi shenichnas dame lefnei lo yilchav le mitzvah ton yisoid. Mi shenichnas dame lefnim bein lechoy ve'bein le mitzvah ein edin sheton yisoid. Yeah, yochal. The Gemara says, so let's make a kal v'choymer to par koy Mashiach, and say that is things that the par koy Mashiach doesn't go by the seir. Let's make a kal v'chomer to par koy Mashiach, that the par koy Mashiach shiur dam should be ma'akif, and we're going to say like this. Ma mi she'ein niknas dam lefnim lo l'chayv lo mitzvah tan yisoid by seir nasi the carbon chatas. It never goes inside the sanctuary. It's only sprinkled on the outside mizbeach. It needs the aside. Mi shnichnas damin lefnim bein lechayva bein lemitzvah ein ledin shetan yisod. So anything that ended up inside the sanctuary certainly should be needing the aside. So now we're going in reverse and saying we're trying to say that the Parakay Mashiach, it's certainly the blood should be sprinkled out. Certainly, the extra blood should be poured on the aside. That we know from a Kal V'chaimer to a Seir Nasi. So therefore, if that's the case, then why did the Torah write by a Parakay Mashiach that you should pour the blood? By the Parakay Mashiach, why did the Torah write by that you should pour the blood El Yisoid Hamizbech Ha'olah? I don't need that. I would have learned that a Kal V'chaimer that you would pour the blood on the Yisoid Mizbach Ha'olah. Elamai must be Yachol Ya'akvenu. Maybe the Torah is telling you that if you don't do it, the Parakay Mashiach is possible. Talmud Loima Eskol Adam Par Yishbach Nitke HaKasav Lasei V'Asiyah Shiar Mitzvah Loima Lecha Shirayim Ein Ma'akven. So the Brisa finishes it up and saying by nothing. Because if you notice that the pasuk writes V'Nasan, first verb, and you put the blood on the corners of the Mizbeach. Then the Torah switches and says Ves Kol Hadam Yishbach, the blood you should pour. The Torah doesn't say V'Shafach as Kol Hadam Hapar, you should pour the blood of the par on your side Mizbach Ha'olah. Since the Torah put the verb after, right, this verb after writing about the blood, it's coming to teach you that even if you didn't do it, it's not ma'akiv. So this brisa is a very clear statement that Rabbi Shmuel is in agreement that if you don't pour the blood, the extra blood, El Yisoid Mizbach Ha'olah, the carbon chatas, the Parakay Mashiach, the Par Yom Kippurim, they're all kosher. So what does Rabbi Shmuel hold that it's ma'akiv? Must be that Rabbi Shmuel holds if you don't do this extra step of mitzui, if you don't do this extra step, then the bird chatas is no good. Says the Gemara, V'saveh Rabbi Shmuel, mitzi chatas oif ma'akev. Does Rabbi Shmuel hold that you must press the chatas oif to the wall, and if you don't do that, it's no good? Well, Tana Tebei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel taught us, V'hanisha badam yimatzei. V'hanisha yimatzei. We go to Amid Beis. V'she'einin yitzur lo yimatzei. The Torah that Rabbi Shmuel says that if you don't have any blood, if you did enough of a squeeze of the blood, and there's no blood in this bird, so you don't do step 3. That's also okay. So we see Rabbi Shmuel himself holds that if you don't squeeze the blood, if you don't squeeze the bird against the wall of the Mizbeach, it's also okay. Answers the Gemara, you're right. Terei Tanoi of Aliba, the Rabbi Shmuel. There's two Tanoim against the two Tanoim that it's an opinion of what Rabbi Shmuel said. Did Rabbi Shmuel say that Mitzui is Me'akif? And this brisa seems to say that Rabbi Shmuel says Mitzui is not Me'akif. So basically, up until now, we learned the Gemara is very inclined to say that shiore are not ma'akev. That means that if you didn't pour the extra blood on the side of the mizbeach, the carbon is still kosher. So now the Gemara is going to try to bring a brisa from here till the Tana Rabbanan. We're going to bring a brisa. We're going to bring a brisa that seems to say that shiore are me'akev. That if you don't do it, the carbon is pasul. And then the Gemara is going to refute that. So the Gemara is going to say that, oh, maybe there is no, we don't have a source of anybody saying that Shiyarim Amiakiv, and then we'll stop. Oma Rami Bachama. Rabbi Bachama said, Hi Tana, there is another Tana, Sava Shiyarayim Akvin, that if you don't pour the extra blood after the sprinkling down the Soid HaMizbeach, Me'akve, the carbon is possible. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, by a regular carbon chatas, the Torah tells you that the kohen that did the sprinkling, he should eat the carbon chatas. If a person brings, like, say, a female animal, female sheep for a carbon chatas, the carbon that the kohen that did the kapara, he eats the carbon chatas. So we darshan oiser shnit dam lamala, only if he did it correctly by putting the sprinkling on the corners of the mizbeach. But if he sprinkled the carbon chatas on the bottom of the mizbeach, below the midpoint, he didn't go to the corners, the carbon chatas is possible. Says the Gemara, Marta v'chimayin basa, where I think that there would be a havam in it to say that the carbon would be kosher if you sprinkled it on the bottom of the mizbeach. The Torah tells you on carbon chatas, go on to the top of the mizbeach and by the corners. Where would I think that you're allowed to sprinkle it on the bottom of the mizbeach? Because Michlal Shenema, the Torah tells us the dams of yishav al mizbeach, the blood of Yeshchita you should pour on the mizbeach. So it means one pour. Lamanu, that pasuk taught us, lintonim b'matan arba, a carbon, let's say a regular oila, where you're supposed to do 4 sprinklings, right? 2 on each wall. Shtaim shein arba. If you did only 1 sprinkling, you're fine. The carbon is kosher. So because you shafech. The manush and if you did it with 1 sprinkling keeper, it's okay. So I would have thought yochel afani tanalamal and son lamata keeper. So I would have thought the carbon chatas, if you did it on top and you ended up doing it on the bottom, it should work. That's why we need the pasuk oisa. Says the Gemara, v'dinhu nema domin lamala v'nemra dom lamata. Ma dom. So wait a second. I can learn it from a kal v'choima. What do I need oisa? Ma dom and hamura lamata. Just by we have another pasuk that says by a carbon oif, you're supposed to do it on the bottom. Like you hear by the carbon oif, chatas oif, you're supposed to do it on the bottom. Whereas in animal, you do it on the top, you're supposed to do it on the bottom. I have another question. It says by a carbon oif that's supposed to be done on the bottom of the mizbeach. Shenusana lamal, if you do it on top of the mizbeach, loy keeper, it doesn't work. So av damim hamura lamala. So I would say that the blood that was supposed to be done on the top, im nasan lamata loy keeper. So again, I don't need Isa because what do I need Isa to tell me that a carbon chatas, if you do it on the bottom, an animal carbon chatas, if you do it on the bottom, it's no good. I should learn that from a carbon oif. A carbon oif, if you do it on the top, it's no good. So a carbon animal, if you do it on the bottom, it's no good. So I don't need Isa. So the Gemara says, loy, not so. Loy kipar. I could say like this, that no, by carbon oif, you never have any blood go to the top of the mizbeach. You just do those 3 steps. You do the malika, you do the zrika, and then you do mitzvah. Nothing goes to the top. But a carbon chatas, a regular animal carbon chatas, after you do the sprinkling 4 times around the corners, you're supposed to put the extra at the bottom. Sheyesh mehem karv lamata. You put the extra shirayim on the bottom of the mizbeach. So since you're anyway putting shirayim on the bottom of mizbeach, I might think the actual initial sprinkling of the carbon chatas would be kosher if you put it on the bottom of the mizbeach, and that's why I need Isa to teach me not so. So the Gemara says, let me just. The Gemara is continuing to discuss why do I need Isa. So to teach you that you don't get a kapara, I would know that from a kal b'chomer. So the Gemara says like this: Damim aprimi yachichu. I'll prove it from the blood that goes into the base inside the sanctuary. Sheyesh mechem kara bechutz, that you part of it, the shirayim, you put outside the outside mizbeach. Although the initial blood goes inside the sanctuary, the leftover blood goes outside the sanctuary. If you put the initial bloods of the chatas pnimi on the outside mizbeach, leikipa doesn't work. So again, the Gemara is trying to prove that you don't need isa, because I know from other points that isa, that if you mess up and you don't follow directions with the regular carbon chatas, if you put instead of putting it on the four corners, you put it on the bottom of the mizbeach, certainly it would not be, you won't get a kapara. So I don't need oisa. So the Gemara says no. Lo imamarta bedama pnimin sheim mizbeach hapnimin markim. Time be'el yoinim shari kronis mirakas isim nesan anamata kasherim. What the Gemara, what the Brisa seems to say, is by domim pnimium, by chatas pnimi, you still need the extra step of putting the shirayim on the outside mizbeach. But by the elyonim, by the carbon chatas chitzaina, that if you put it on the corners, you don't need to have shirayim put on the yisoida mizbeach. And so therefore, I would think, so chatas chitzaina is less than a chatas punimi. I would think im the lamata ksherin. So I would think that since a chatas chitzoina is less than a chatas panimi, so it wouldn't passel it if you put the initial sprinkling of the chatas chitzoina on the bottom of the mizbeach. That's what I need. Talmud loima oisa shnitten dam lamala v'loy shnitten dam lamata. So that only that the carbon chatas chitzoina is only kosher if you put it on the corners and not if you put it on the bottom of the mizbeach. But what you see that the Bryce is stuck in, that the domim pnimium she'ein mizbach pnimim marken, that means it seems to imply by the chatas pnimi that if you don't put the shurayim on the outside the mizbeach, it's not kosher. So we see that there is an opinion in the Brisa that says, at least by a chatas pnimi, if you don't put shirayim on the yisoid mizbeach, it's not kosher. So the Gemara says, no, my she'ein mizbeach hapinim markim, what that Brisa meant to say is, lav elu shraim, isn't it shraim? Amalei rava ihachi, if it was talking about the shirayim, teisa b'kal v'chayma. Ma shirayim shesoif pnim, shesoifim chayva b'chutz, asam b'tchila b'chutz le'kiper, hanital mala she'ein soifim chayva l'mata, v'asam b'tchila l'mata, ein edin sh'le'kiper. If you're learning the Brisa that way, that b'chatas pnimi has an obligation to put shirayim on the yisoid of the outside of the mizbeach, then I have a simple kal v'choyma that will tell me you don't need isa. Because I'll say like this, mad is a chatas panimi, that eventually you have to put the blood on the outside mizbeach, and if you put it on the outside mizbeach, if you do the initial sprinkling outside mizbeach, not on the inside mizbeach, like keep you don't get a kapara, haniton mala, something that was put that's supposed to be only put on the corners, that you that you have no other obligation, and you do it on the bottom, certainly it shouldn't bring a kapara. In other words, the simple, since if a chatas panimi eventually has some part of the blood that goes on the outside mizbeach, is still not kosher if you do the initial sprinkling on the outside mizbeach. So I'll say kolshkein by chatas chitzaina, we're only supposed to put it on the corners, and you're never supposed to put any blood. You don't have an obligation to put any blood on the bottom of the mizbeach. Certainly, if you put the initial sprinkling on the bottom of the mizbeach, it's not kosher. So again, I don't need oisa. Ella, that this brisa must hold that nothing shirayim is there's no shirayim, there's no obligation to do shirayim. If there is shirayim, put it onto the mizbach, put it down that drain. But if there's no obligation to leave over in the cup, or even if you have left over in the cup, to pour it down the drain. If you didn't do it, the carbon is kosher b'diavad. What the Brisa meant to say is ein mizbeach hapnim markum b'vad el proiches, that by the Brisa just wanted to say that the carbon panimi is more chomerdik than a carbon chitzoina, whereas a carbon chatas chitzoina needs one sprinkling on the four corners of the outside mizbeach. A chatas panimi, such as the par kohen Mashiach, par helam davar shetziber, these need two kaparas. These need a kapara, not you're only sprinkling on the mizbeach hapnimi, but you also have to have a sprinkling towards the pareiches, towards the curtain. So therefore, it's more chomerdik because each one it didn't just doing it on mizbeach hapnimi wasn't enough to bring the kapara. You needed also on the pareiches. So that's what the Brisa meant to say. So basically, all we got through saying here is that there is no Tana that holds Shirayim is Ma'akun, that you need to pour blood on the Mizbach Ha'olah, and there's no, doesn't seem that there's any obligation for that. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow with Zevachim Daf Yomi.